can begin. Welcome to all of you who are here for the second week in a row. We're doing an introduction at this point, an introduction to Tanya, just to understand what is Tanya, what's it all about, why should you be learning it, what difference is it going to make to you as an individual. That's our journey at this point in time. That's our journey. So we left off last week with a question, and I know that some people were a little perturbed by the fact that we ended on a cliffhanger, but that's okay because we'll come back to it and we'll talk about it this evening. So I'm going to remind you of the question and then still leave you hanging for a little bit, because in order to answer the question, we may need other information. Oh, by the way, welcome to one of the classic elements of how Hasidus operates. We don't ask questions and then just answer them. Because if you have a question that is quickly answered, usually what you'll find out afterwards is that the answer wasn't necessarily sufficient. So the way that we do things in Hasidus, we ask a question, we say, now hang on, before we can discuss this question properly, really what we need to do is provide more context and further information. So the question we left off with last week was, we're about to study a book that is called Tanya. And the way that it gets its name, Tanya, is, not surprisingly, because the opening phrase is Tanya. That's the opening phrase of the book. Tanya b'sofer gimel denida, as we will shortly learn. Well, not shortly, as we'll learn at some point. So it makes sense. If you've got a word that is the opening word, that becomes the word that is attributed to the book. You see that in the Torah portion as well. Very often, the name of the parasha, the name of the Torah portion, is associated with a word that appears right at the beginning of the portion. But it's not that simple. And the reason it's not that simple is because names are a big deal for people, and definitely in Judaism. If a name is used in Judaism, that name speaks to the essence of that particular item or entity. So just to give you an example that perhaps you're familiar with, perhaps not familiar with. The Torah tells us, shortly after Adam was created, so the Torah says that he named all of the animals. And you can just imagine, just picture, here's the first human being who's ever been created, looking around, and there are all these creatures, and then he's got almost like a dictionary book. You know those name books that people used to use once upon a time before they used to go on the internet, like people do now, and they just kind of Google, is this a Jewish name? So imagine if he's got these names and he's kind of assigning names. This is going to be called a lion, that's going to be called an elephant, or whatever the case is. So it seems weird that the Torah should give us that bit of information. I mean, it's interesting, obviously, that the names of things are attributed to Adam, but why is it necessary for us to know? Here's the backstory, and it will relate to what we're going to learn this evening. The backstory is that at the time of creation, there was a big hoo-ha in heaven. Don't make people. Really? God? Seriously? Don't make people. They are disasters. I don't know how much you know people, but people mess up. People let the team down. People destroy the environment. People don't treat other people well. Give people a mission to fulfill, and they are bound to fail. That's people. So the angels were not too impressed with the suggestion of having people, and they said to Hashem, don't do it. Don't create people. Well, obviously Hashem had his own plan, and he doesn't rely on their opinions. And Hashem went ahead and he created people. And then when Adam got up to name the animals, it's at that moment that Hashem says to the angels, see, you couldn't do that. You couldn't name the animals. And the angels are kind of taken aback, and they're like, wow, you're right. This is an incredible prototype being that you have made. Human, wow. Okay, come on, what's the big deal naming animals, or naming anything for that matter? Really? What's the big deal? So you arbitrarily pull a name out of your, second name out of your thumb. What's the big deal? You name this, you name that. The concept is that in Judaism, a name describes the essence of a being. If you can give something its name in Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue, the language of creation, if you know how to identify that name, that means that you know what the essence of that particular entity is. So Adam, as an example, Adam, the first human, I know we call Adam Adam, and we kind of think of Adam as male. But the truth is, Adam initially was this prototype human being. Adam comes from the word dam, blood, because a human has to have blood in order to survive. It comes from the word Adama, the earth, because he's created out of the earth. It's from the word Adameh, which means I will aspire to be like. I will aspire to be like God, and so on. In other words, names are not arbitrary in Judaism. Names are highly significant. If somebody chose to name this book Tanya, it's not just because the first word of the book happens to be Tanya. There's got to be something more to it. So we need to explore that, and we need to understand what is the book and why is it described by this particular word. So this is where we left off last week. Last week we discovered that the phrase used at the beginning of Tanya, which is a quotation from the Talmud in the tractate Nida at the end of the 3rd chapter, says, Tanya, we learnt the following principle. And we'll come to that principle in time. We'll learn the chapter and we'll see what the principle is. You go back to your Tanya, your Talmud, you pull the volume off the shelf, you page through to the particular reference, you have a look inside, and it does not say Tanya. It uses the rest of the phrase, but it does not say Tanya, we have learned. It says, Dorash Rabbi Simloi. There was a sage called Rabbi Simloi, and he interpreted and he gave a drosha. You know what a drosha is? For most people, it's a signal from the rabbi that now you can have a nap. But actually what a drosha is, it's an interpretation, the extrapolation of a verse in the Torah or a concept in Judaism. So he gets up and he says, this Rabbi Simloi says, I want to teach you something about the nature of your own soul. And he tells us a story about the soul prior to coming down into this earth, prior to birth. Why does the Alter Rebbe, a man who was leading at the time a highly controversial movement, a person who had so many detractors in the religious world, so many people who claimed that he did not know how to learn Torah properly, why would he start with what appears to be a misquotation? I mean, it's a great way to torpedo your own book before you get it off the shelves. So why did he do it? Okay, so we'll rush to the Alter Rebbe's defense and we'll say, hang on a second, you know that if you're familiar with Talmudic history, there are girsa'os, which means that things they weren't printed. They were handwritten copies, and sometimes there was a bit of a discrepancy between this copy that was passed down through that tradition and this copy. I'm not talking about discrepancies that would impact actual law or major issues of philosophy. A word here, a word there. So there happens to be a girsa, there happens to be a version of this statement that happens to start with the word Tanya, but it is not the mainstream version. It's not the popular version. So why then did the Alter Rebbe choose the less popular version if it could easily have blown up in his face as, you see, these Hasidim don't know how to learn. There's got to be something to this word Tanya. And we've got to understand what that is, because that will be the gateway to us understanding what we want out of this book. So what do we want out of this book? It's an intriguing book, the Tanya. Traditionally, historically, it was always a small book. For whatever reason, all the original prints of Tanya were very small. I remember, I think it was in the 80s, that we went around, well, not me personally, but the Chabad movement went around South Africa and printed Tanya books in every community that had Jewish representation. And there were these tiny little Tanya books. And at that time, the Rebbe had a campaign that throughout the world we should print Tanya books. They were always small. Today you get large print Tanyas. I guess you get Tanyas with English, Tanyas with commentary. But the original book was small. And we know the cliche about dynamite and small packages. But the Alter Rebbe had a colleague called Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, and he was an incredible mystic and a leader of a Hasidic movement in his own right. When he got to learn the Tanya just after it had been published, he said, I cannot understand how Rabbi Shneur Zalman was able to compact such a big God into such a small book. Now, of course, most people are going to say, at the end of the day, big God, small book, sounds like effectively what you're saying is he made it understandable, and that is definitely a big part of the whole point of Hasidus, is to make spirituality understandable and accessible to the average individual. But that's not what he was saying over here. What he was saying is, this little book is going to expand your perception of God to such an extent that you'll never believe you were ever able to see the world as you previously did. And in that expansion of your perception of God, you get an expansion of your perception of yourself. There's an old saying that Hasidim use, that the purpose of Hasidus, of which Tanya is the seminal work, is to illustrate to a person how small they are and how great they can become. That's the little book. This is the little Tanya manual for your soul. This is the book that helps a person to appreciate how powerful your soul is. I actually tried that earlier on social media, and I asked the question, how strong is your soul? And it was intriguing to see some of the responses that came back. And one or two people were confused by the question, like they didn't understand what exactly, what was I asking? How strong is your soul? But really, I suppose, how strong do we perceive our inner spiritual being to be? So the backstory of that, which will help us to understand why it's called Tanya, which will tell us the story of what this is all about, has to do with another story. Have you ever noticed? Hasidim enjoy telling stories. So if you ever want to illustrate something and there's a Hasidic rabbi teaching, you can expect that there's going to be a story and it will probably have a king or a wagon driver. It's, one of the two. In this particular story, what happened was there was conflict. Not only was the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, attacked from the outside by other religious leaders, he was actually attacked at one point by his own colleagues because they felt that he had perhaps gone a little bit too far. And that's the story that I'd like to share with you because it's really insightful into understanding what the nature of Tanya is, what it seeks to achieve. And from that, we'll be able to come back eventually and see the word and what the word illustrates. So the story goes that the Alter Rebbe had a lot of pushback from his friends. They felt he was teaching too much Hasidus. Now remember from last week, the Baal Shem Tov initiated a new perception about Torah, the Hasidic insight. The Alter Rebbe was a student of the Baal Shem Tov's student. So he was at a point where this was already a consolidated movement that was now branching out. And while many of the other Hasidic leaders took anecdotes, little gems of the Baal Shem Tov's teachings and focused on them, the Alter Rebbe took them as seeds that he grew into massive insights, developed treatises on Torah, on Hasidus. So on one particular occasion, like I said, there was some pushback and some of the colleagues said, you shouldn't be doing this. It's not supposed to go out. Not everybody is at a stage that they can understand all these profound concepts. And on one particular occasion, one of the vociferous opponents to the Alter Rebbe came across a piece of paper with teachings of the Baal Shem Tov that had been lying in the gutter. He took the salid paper, marched over to the Alter Rebbe, and he said, see, Exhibit A. This is why we should be more cautious. This is why we should preserve the real depth of the teaching of Hasidus only to those who qualify, to those who are studious, to those who have proven themselves. It's not just to be for the average person on the street. You don't go, if it was in the 21st century, you don't go teaching Tanya on Zoom. That's not on. It's got to be, the most elite of the elite. Because otherwise, look at this, the deepest pearls of divine wisdom lying in the gutter. And in response to that, the Alter Rebbe told a parable which has become one of the most well-used parables in the whole of Hasidus. It says, once there was a king, and the king had an only son who he loved absolutely dearly. It meant this individual, this son meant everything to him. And unfortunately, sadly, the crown prince, took ill. And it wasn't just an ordinary illness, it was a severe illness, and the doctors couldn't work out what was wrong with him. And they tried one method and a different medication, and nothing worked. And the prince deteriorated further and further. The king obviously sent messages all over the place throughout his kingdom, neighboring kingdoms. He brought every homeopath, allopath, surgeon, voodoo, who knows what. Everybody came. And they all tried, and nobody could assist. And this boy had at that point slipped into unconsciousness, and there was no hope. It looked like there was no hope. And then one doctor arrived from out of town, and he checked the prince, and he went to the king, and he says, I have good news and I have not so good news for you. The good news is, I know a way that we could save your son. The not so good news is, I don't think you'll appreciate how I want to do it. So the king said, look, this is my son. I'll do anything. So the doctor said, I've noticed that in your crown, there's a particular jewel that really makes the crown. That's the epicenter of the whole beauty and magnificence of the royal crown. But I've noticed that the mineral properties of that particular gem are exactly what is needed to save your son. So this is what I propose. We take the gem, we grind it down into a powder, we dissolve the powder into water. We pour the water into the prince's mouth. He's obviously unconscious. So a lot of that water is going to go to waste. But maybe, just maybe, a few of those drops will enter into the prince's system. And maybe, just maybe, it will save his life. Now, if you were a rational person standing off to the side looking at this objectively, you could have told the king, sounds like there are too many maybes in this story. I don't like the odds. This is the crown jewel. This is what makes you who you are in all your magnificence. I don't know if it's worth taking the chance. But this is a king and his child. There are no maybes. There's no rational argument to be had. It's clear what needs to be done. And so without hesitation, the king says, you take that jewel, you grind it down, you make that potion, you pour it down the prince's throat, and let's hope for the best. Says the Alter Rebbe, in this period of history, the Jewish world was on its knees. We had been battered materially. The economics of the Jewish community were a shambles. We had been battered from an anti-Semitism point of view. The Chmielnicki uprising decimated communities, destroyed people's faith. Shabtai Tzvi, the false messiah, all the hope that people had built up was completely trashed. Not to mention the spiritual poverty of this community. The fact that there was this distinction between classes within the Jewish world. Judaism was on its knees. A good portion of the community, God forbid, could have disappeared at that period in history. The prince is unconscious. Says the Alter Rebbe, so God takes from his crown, the crown of Hashem is the Torah. And within that crown, there are different parts, different components. Some is gold, some might be velvet, some might be this kind of jewel, some that kind of jewel. And if you track Jewish history, you will see that different parts of the crown were released for public use at different stages of history. There was a time in history where there was no Talmud. And then there came a time where we needed a Talmud. And there came a time where we needed a Shulchan Aruch, a code of Jewish law that was easy to follow instead of wading through the Talmud. Said the Baal Shem Tov, the time has come to take the essence, that beauty, the prime, pristine, beautiful stone of God's crown, grind it down into language that you and I can understand, and feed it to the masses. Because whatever drops will get into our system will revive us spiritually. It's something that stood the test of time. You know, if you look at the course of history, you look how Judaism was at that period, and you look how Judaism is today, we're a long way off from rescuing the entire Jewish world. We have deep-seated issues today of assimilation, intermarriage, people's apathy towards their Judaism, secularization of the community. We have many challenges. But we also have an incredible amount of people who are engaged with their Judaism. We have an international network of yeshivas, of communities, of a Baal Teshuvah movement of people. That's not about becoming religious. It's about re-engaging with their Judaism. That was the Alter Rebbe's argument. Reason to have this means, this teaching, is to wake the soul. To wake a soul that is somewhat unconscious. Hasidim say that the Baal Shem Tov showed us what we should do as Jews. Many people had lost their way. They had lost hope. They had lost their optimism in the fact that they could do any of these things. The Alter Rebbe, through the Chabad system, came to teach us not just what we should do, but how we could do it. How we could wake up the soul. How we could translate these incredibly inspiring, powerful, life-changing thoughts into a reality in our own lives. How we could find a massive God in a small enough book that we could relate to. That's what we're looking to do in the book of Tanya. But that's not the whole story yet. That's not the whole story. You see, if you want to understand and appreciate what something is out to achieve, often you have to understand based on either what the objective is or what the conflict is. I'll explain to you what I mean by that. So let's say, for argument's sake, there's an expression that we use, Yedias hamachlo chatzi refuah, that God forbid if a person is suffering with a medical ailment and they don't know what's wrong with them. You know what that experience is like, right? You just don't know what's wrong. You don't know. It's like, I've got this symptom and that niggly thing or whatever. I don't know what I'm dealing with. Well, we can't help you. Nobody can really cure an illness if the person cannot identify what the illness is. But Yedias hamachlo, when you know the illness, chatzi refuah, that is halfway already to the cure. So often you learn about something by understanding what it is up against. If we understand that at different periods in history, there were different parts of Torah that were introduced into the system to be able to counter different challenges. So as we understand each of those challenges, we understand what each part of Torah was there to achieve. If we understand the nature of the challenge that Hasidus came to address, which is this unconscious community, that helps us. What's the challenge? And if we understand the objective, there's a thing that they say, the Gemara says, Mi shetorach be'erev Shabbos yoichal b'Shabbos. Anybody who works before Shabbos will be able to eat on Shabbos. Okay, this is not higher grade stuff. It's not rocket science. Everybody knows that. If you would like to have a cholent in your house on Shabbos afternoon, guess what? You've got to put it up to cook before Shabbos comes in. Not rocket science. Anybody knows this. Why did the Gemara, the greatest sages of history, people with these brilliant minds, you had to tell me that? You had to tell me if I don't cook a meal, I'm not going to have anything to eat? No, what they're telling us is, if you don't prepare what you would like to have, you're not going to have it. Or as Yogi Berra would say, if you don't know where you're going, you'll probably land up somewhere else. So if you don't know what the objective is, it's quite difficult to understand what you're trying to achieve. So far we've spoken about how Hasidus is designed as a cure for a particular ailment, a Judaism in major decline, a Judaism that needed recess. Hasidus gives the recess, but that doesn't give me an objective. See, that's the thing. If you've got an emergency situation, so then you tackle the emergency. When the emergency is over, you pack up your emergency equipment, you put it away. That's why the colleagues of the Alter Rebbe had an issue with him. They said the emergency has been averted. The Baal Shem Tov came. He woke up the community. He passed on the baton to the Maggid of Mezrich, who established a network of students, and now Judaism is thriving again. Pack up the emergency equipment, put it away, don't use it again until we need it next. And the Alter Rebbe said, yes, but all you've done is you've identified what Hasidus does in an emergency, but you haven't yet identified what the other side of Hasidus is. And when you do, then you appreciate why we're learning Tanya. We're not only learning Tanya in case you might, as an individual, feel, oh my gosh, my neshama is just like dry. I'm feeling flat. I'm apathetic. It's been a rough year. All sorts of things happen and they suck the life out of me. But what if you don't feel that way? What if you feel, I'm good, I'm inspired, I'm observant, I'm connected. Why do I need this stuff? And that was a question that many people asked, particularly religious people. Oh good, Hasidus, that's for those people. Those people who are not engaged in their Judaism. They needed somebody to throw them a rope and yank them up and help them and, look after them. But we're good. We learn, we engage, we have connection. We don't need this stuff. Mysticism, airy-fairy, things that talk about souls. Give me a good geschmack piece of Gemara that talks about the legal wranglings of what happens if somebody's ox gores your cow. Oh, that I can relate to. But now you're going to start to talk about souls and flighty things. I don't think I need that. That's what you need when you want to attract people. It's the window dressing of Judaism. We're already inside the shop. We've already got an account. We don't need you to do your glossy adverts in order to get us through the door. So there's another side to it, fascinating side to it. Jewish history, as we know, is a continuum, obviously. So it's not just that there's a timeline of history and things happen in the past and then other things happened and sometimes they're related and sometimes not. Judaism is one consistent, developing timeline that starts with creation and culminates with what we call the age of Mashiach. At the time of creation, Hashem makes it absolutely clear, absolutely. Light is given and then removed. The very first creation is the creation of light. Vayehi or, on the first day. And there was light. But if you have a look, the Talmudic sages teach us what happened to that light. Why don't we see it today? That light was not the sun. The sun is only created on day 4. So what is that light and what happened to it? The Talmudic sages tell us it is a light that allowed you to see from one end of existence to the other. In other words, you had absolute clarity. Where did it go? So they tell us Hashem hid that light for it to be revealed at a future point in the time of the age of Mashiach. Where did he hide it? Say the sages, he hid it inside the Torah. So how many people do you know who open up the Torah and they can see from one end of the universe to the other? How many people do you know who learn the Torah and they have that absolute clarity? They have no doubts, no issues, no distractions? No, nobody I know. Maybe you hang out with a very spiritual crowd. I don't know. So it was hidden within the Torah. That doesn't mean that as you open the Torah, just the light emanates. The room is suddenly radiant. It doesn't mean that. It's hidden in the Torah. In your experience of Torah learning itself, you've got to dig and drill and discover that there's something beneath the surface that's beneath the surface. And when you do find that, you actually start to taste the light of the time of Mashiach, even today. So, I mentioned before that the Gemara says, Mi shetorach be'erev Shabbos yoichal b'Shabbos, that a person who prepares before Shabbos will eat on Shabbos, which yes, it does mean you have to prepare in advance, but it doesn't only mean prepare in advance, it means prepare appropriately. Because obviously if you're going to prepare a salad, you're not going to have a cholent. You know what I'm saying? It's got to be prepared accordingly. But there's another saying. The other saying is Toyameho Chaim Zochu. It's a verse in Tehillim that the sages extrapolate to mean if you taste some of the food of Shabbos before Shabbos comes in, that's a special thing. That's a taste of the next world. And that's why, by the way, anybody knows, if you hang out in a frum home, you know, comes Friday, people are picking at the food. Mitzvah, you got to taste the food before Shabbos. You know, I'm just going to have a little bit of soup, just got a little bit of this. Part of the experience. If you're really, really frum and you live in like Jerusalem, Thursday night they're already selling cholent. So you can taste Shabbos already in advance. The Arizal, the great mystic, the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, the person who revolutionized most of what we understand about Kabbalah. So he said, Toyamer Chaim Zochu has got nothing to do with food and Shabbos as much as it has to do with as you get closer to the Messianic age, which is considered an age like Shabbos, you start to taste Mashiach experiences in this world. Because you can't just change from a world as we know it to a world of Mashiach. You need a diet. You need a diet that's going to prepare you. You need to start thinking that way, seeing the world that way. You need to start finding the light that was hidden beneath the surface in Torah. And that's what Chassidus is. Yes, the Baal Shem Tov's Chassidus was very much about stopping the gap, stopping the bleed, saving the nation in their throes of despair. And the Alter Rebbe's Chassidus was, the emergency is over. Now let's start to taste what it would be like to live in the time of Mashiach. Let's start to taste a new perspective, a completely different Judaism, a Judaism that makes you realize that what you used to think was Gan Eden is Gehenna compared to what Gan Eden really is. A Judaism that makes you understand that in this little book you'll find a God that you didn't believe existed. Your eyes will open, you'll have clarity, not just what you should be doing, but what you can do. Or to put it in the context of that question earlier on social media, it will allow you to discover the power of your soul. That's why he chose the name Tanya. Out of all the possible names that he could have chosen. because the way that spiritual things work, as we'll see in chapter 6, the way that spiritual things work is Ze leumas ze. It's a verse in the book of Eov, but the Alter Rebbe talks about it a lot in chapter 6. Whatever exists on the positive side has an equal opposite force on the negative side. You could call it the first law of, I don't know how you say physics, but in a spiritual way, right? Spiritics. The first law of spiritics. Every positive force has an opposing equivalence, never equal, right? Obviously the holy side is more powerful because it's linked in directly to God. But there's an equivalent opposing force. Or to put it into different words, one of the key things we'll learn about in Hasidus, in Tanya we'll study it in chapters 6, 7, and 8, is that there's a notion called klippa, which basically means there are really two realities you could live in. You could either live in a reality of awareness, or you could live in a reality of lack of awareness. So either you live with your eyes open or with your eyes closed. Either you live that Hashem is real, or you live that Hashem is in a book and tax season is real. Which is probably what most people feel. Or COVID is real. So that reality that we live in, that blinds our eyes to seeing the truth of God, we call that klippa. Klippa literally means a shell. We're going to talk about it in much greater detail later in Tanya. But it basically means something that blocks you from seeing what's real. There are various klippas, and different times in history have had different klippas that were dominant, and different societies grapple with different klippas more than other societies, and individuals grapple with different klippas differently. So for example, back in biblical times, the overarching klippa was the klippa of idolatry, and that's why you find these incredible people with brilliant minds running off and bowing down to trees and putting up Baal idols, which none of us would ever do. Could you imagine in your wildest dream putting an Asherah tree in your backyard, God forbid, and bowing to it? I mean, it's unthinkable for us. Why? Because that klippa is pretty much vanquished. It's no longer relevant in our time. And at the time of the Second Temple era, we know that the big klippa at that time was the klippa of disunity. And that's why there was such a collapse in the Jewish community till people literally were fighting a civil war inside Jerusalem while the Romans outside were waiting to kill us. Every period in history, every community, and every individual has a unique klippa to deal with. At the time of the Alter Rebbe, just 200 plus years ago, the big klippa of that time in that society was the klippa, the barrier that learned Jews had against discovering what lies beneath what they were learning. In other words, the klippa of the time was where people were satisfied with what they had learned already and didn't want to rock the boat with anything that might be deeper, different, challenge my thinking. And as a result of that, it's a klippa that causes learned people to become smug and a little arrogant. Every klippa has a name. We have a klippa called Amalek. Yes, there was also a nation called Amalek, but there's a klippa called Amalek. That's spiritual apathy. We have a klippa called Moav. We have a klippa called Canaan. We have all kinds of klippas. There is a klippa called Tanya. That's its name. It's this particular bug that only infects people with Torah knowledge. And it infects them in a very unique way. It infects them that they become quite self-assured. They become condescending. They dig their heels in and don't school me in another perspective of what Torah says, because I know what's right. I know who's right. I know how we should divide the community, and I justify why it is that I should treat other people who don't necessarily have the same degree, even if it's not their fault, of learning as I have. They deserve to be shafted because I know. That's the first order of what Tanya wanted to address. The Tanya klippa. The serum is made of the same stuff as the illness. It's the same name to illustrate that we're going to attack directly what this illness is. Now, there are two ways to treat an illness, as we know. Well, one doesn't really treat the illness, but it is what people like to do. The one is you tackle the symptoms. So somebody shows this particular symptom, you give them that particular ointment. They have that particular symptom, so you give them pain relief. You have that particular symptom, so you give them some physical support. It's great. You'll keep the person comfortable. You'll never heal them. It's what we call easy response. Then there's another approach. Somebody comes, they exhibit certain symptoms, and the doctor says, well, it's actually got nothing to do with the symptoms. Let's run a whole lot of tests beneath the surface, and let's understand what causes these symptoms. Why do they behave this way? Why do they have this outlook? Why are they condescending? Why is there separation in our community? Why is there this smug attitude? Where does it come from? Let's dig deeper to this beneath the surface that's beneath the surface. And let's find what the source of understanding this issue is. Because if you can nip an issue at its source, you're not going to fight and fight and fight. If you can catch it at the source, then you just keep working and keep developing and keep growing, because now you're not fighting symptoms, you're changing realities. And that's why I called it Tanya. Because if you take the word Tanya and you jumble the letters just a little bit, so Tanya is spelled Tov, Nun, Yud, Aleph. If you jumble those letters, you get the word Eitan, which has multiple translations. The word Eitan appears a few times in the Tanakh, and each time it's got a different meaning. Eitan means powerful. Like if you want to say that somebody is really strong and nothing can stand in their way, you say that that person is Eitan, like the pasuk says, V'ha Eisanim moistei aretz. The powerful ones are the ones who established the earth. Eitan means powerful, unstoppable. Or you could say Eitan means immutable, doesn't shift, doesn't move. Eison moishavecha. Phrase in the Torah that says, your stronghold is absolutely firm. It's Eison, it's unshakable. Or the word Eitan means ancient. And in fact, when it says, V'ha Eisanim moistei aretz, that the powerful ones established the earth, it's actually the ancient ones are the ones who established the earth. Eitan is powerful to the point that nothing can stop it. Eitan is strong to the point that nothing can shake it. Eitan is ancient. And all three of those words are synonyms for our soul. What is the soul? The soul is Eitan. It's ancient. You know, people always say, I think so-and-so is an old soul, and they kind of intend it as a really nice compliment. It's a deep person, they're an old soul. Not for now, but it's an interesting conversation for other times. Old soul means that you've had to recycle a few times, probably indicates that the person didn't do so well the last couple of lives. I don't know if it's such a big compliment, but anyhow. The Baal Shem Tov intriguingly said that the Alter Rebbe was a new soul, a soul that had never been to earth before. And because of that, the Baal Shem Tov, who never really engaged with the Alter Rebbe because they lived apart, and the Baal Shem Tov passed away when the Alter Rebbe was young, so they didn't have much interaction. But the Baal Shem Tov made a huge celebration on the day that the Alter Rebbe was born, because he said a new soul, new energy has entered into this world. But souls, generally old souls, not a big chap. Ancient is not a factor of how many times the soul's been here or how much experience it has. The soul is fundamentally ancient. You know why? Because it is, as the expression goes in the book of Daniel, it is part of Atik Yoimin, the ancient of days. There's nothing more ancient than God, because God is forever. God always was. Nothing precedes God. This is the book of the Eitan. This is the book that will teach you that your neshama has power not because of you, not because of anything you've done, not because of anything you have, but because your soul is directly part of the Eitan, the most original, longest lasting entity that exists, God Himself. So you want to find power in this book? The power is to discover who you are. And when you recognize that your neshama is part and parcel of God, which is the primary focus of chapter 2, that your neshama is a piece of God, then you realize your neshama is immutable. Nothing can shift your soul. No external force, no temptation, no distraction, no personal foibles. Nothing can shift your soul because it is one with God. And just as God is immutable, obviously, with a capital I, so is your own neshama. And therefore, Eitan is powerful. When you recognize the force that lies within, when you recognize that you sit on the base of Hashem himself, then you realize that there is nothing your neshama cannot achieve. Of course, I'm not saying over here that you should go off now and say, I'm going to become a world-class actor, or I'm going to become the biggest business person. That's not what your neshama is for. Yeah, of course, those are great things. And maybe they'll make you really happy and famous and who knows what, but your neshama is here to achieve whatever it is that Hashem put it here to achieve. And if you want to know what Hashem put it here to achieve, learn this book. Because this book will tell us why we're here, what our makeup is, what the objective is, where we should go, what the challenges will be, and the fact that we can overcome those challenges. That's why he chose to start with this word, Tanya. If you're going to fight whatever happens to be the prevalent klippa of the time, in those days, the prevalent klippa was Tanya itself. This attitude of smugness that infected the religious or learned members of the community. Today, it's probably a completely different klippa, and we can talk about that. What might be the dominant klippa of today's world? But whatever it is, it's actually irrelevant. Because the klippa is a symptom, and the cure lies when you get to the core. The cure lies in shifting how we understand ourselves. It's quite common for people to understand that I'm a victim. I'm just a cog in a wheel. You know, there's a big world out there, and they're all kind of push-pull factors, and there's the media in my ear, and there's the expectations of society, and the demands of my family, and the pressures of time, and all these things that completely overwhelm us, and they do. If I think I'm going to tackle each one of them individually and succeed, I'll exhaust myself before I'm a quarter way down the list. I'm going to go to this therapy to manage my stress. And I'm going to do that kind of exercise to be able to have the energy to get on with my timetable. And then I'm going to have this kind of interaction with my family and read that kind of book and listen to that motivational speaker. By the time you finish, you're so overwhelmed by the things that are supposed to calm you that you're worse off than you started. This book says, don't tackle symptoms. Learn who you are. Understand the power within yourself. Unlike the common talk of the modern world, which says people are fundamentally disempowered, let's support them externally. Let's make movements and marches and organizations and self-help and this kind of help and that kind of diet. This book tells us that the Torah says you have the power to achieve within yourself what your neshama needs to achieve. When a person appreciates, number one, the eitan, the power of my neshama. Number two, that this is the light hidden inside the Torah that can give me clarity and can allow me to see my way clear of any challenge, any distraction that might come up in life, then I know it's not going to happen tomorrow. I'm not going to read the first paragraph or speed read the first 20 paragraphs or chapters of the book, and then my life is going to change. I know and I understand that that's not how things work in real life. I understand that if I want to treat core issues rather than symptoms, it's going to take me time. This is a patience game. It's not going to be overnight. But wouldn't you rather take a long journey to a meaningful destination than take a series of short journeys to disappointing destinations? That's something that the Alter Rebbe will introduce to us even before we get to chapter 1. This principle that we're speaking about now, he'll introduce to us in the cover page of the Tanya, which we'll learn together. We'll actually look at the text together, the cover page of the Tanya. Before we do that, we're going to just go through, without reading the text, we're going to go through the key principles of what he writes as his introduction to the book, just to help us understand the context and how it came to be and what it's intended for. But when we get to that cover page, we're going to come back to this principle and the concept of being able to tackle something something with the patience of the long term, knowing that you're going to make a fundamental shift, rather than that urgency that we have today. Like, click, post, download, make it happen, which unfortunately just leaves us thirsty for more. So that's the journey, please God, that we will go on. The intention is that over the next few weeks, we'll have a look at the introduction that the Alter Rebbe writes to the Tanya, then that cover page, and then, please God, from that, we'll start the actual Tanya itself. I'm going to pause at this point and open for questions.